Dr. Elena Torres adjusted her headset, her eyes scanning the endless rows of dials and screens that filled the control room. The low hum of the machinery was the only sound in the vast, empty observatory. Built in the heart of a remote desert, the observatory was miles from the nearest town, making it an ideal spot for detecting faint, distant signals from deep space. For Elena, who dedicated her life to the search for extraterrestrial life, it was a dream and a curse, a prison of solitude and silence, broken only by the intermittent beeps of distant stars and planets. Her team was small and scattered, each stationed in different wings of the massive facility, connected mostly by radio. It was a world of cold, white lights and machines that hissed and whirred, calculating and listening. The desert night stretched on, a void as vast as the universe she studied, only broken by her sporadic contact with the team members. It was during one of these endless, quiet shifts that the signal came. A low, rhythmic pulse suddenly crackled in her headset, startling her from the monotony. She stiffened, recognizing the telltale pattern of a transmission. Yet, this one was different. It came from Proxima Centauri b, an exoplanet within the habitable zone of the closest star to Earth. The odds of receiving any signal from there were astronomically slim, yet here it was, clear and steady. Her fingers flew over the controls, fine-tuning the frequency, her heartbeat pounding louder than the machinery around her. She pressed a button to alert her team, calling them in. Minutes later, they were crowded around her workstation, listening as the signal played through the speakers. A soft, whispering voice emerged from the static, clear yet calm, human yet not entirely human. It repeated in a rhythmic cadence, almost like a chant, words they couldn't fully understand. But the tone, the texture of the voice, unmistakably sounded human, though distorted, as if echoing from a great distance. The realization struck them like a blow. This voice, this calm, unsettlingly familiar voice, was coming from Proxima Centauri b. Elena's mind raced, trying to reconcile the impossible. The team began exchanging glances, whispering, their voices tinged with disbelief and confusion. Someone suggested it could be an Earth signal bouncing back, or a technical error, but the voice didn't fade. It held steady, unwavering, as if reaching across the void with a purpose. As the initial shock wore off, the team scrambled to analyze it further, breaking down the transmission into individual syllables, then piecing it back together, hoping to find some logical explanation. Yet the signal remained disturbingly clear, its origin consistent and genuine. The voice continued, each repetition growing more complex, layered with static and an odd echo that seemed almost like another voice underneath it, mirroring every word. As Elena listened, she felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, a creeping unease that settled deep in her bones. There was something about the tone, the way the voice lingered on certain syllables, that felt inexplicably personal. She could feel the words drawing her in, as if meant just for her, tapping into a memory she couldn't quite place. The other researchers noticed her growing fixation and looked at her with worried glances, their own discomfort deepening. Over the following hours, subtle malfunctions began to plague the observatory. Equipment that had been working perfectly started acting up. Screens flickered, data streams glitched, and lights dimmed and brightened sporadically. They wrote it off as technical issues, though the timing felt oddly coincidental, amplifying the tense atmosphere in the cold, silent observatory. As the hours ticked by, Elena's obsession with the message deepened. She spent long, sleepless nights replaying the voice, tracing every syllable, every inflection, feeling it grow sharper, more distinct. The voice was changing, shifting almost imperceptibly, and she swore it was becoming more familiar, though she couldn't put her finger on why. Soon, the words themselves grew clearer, taking on a tone of urgency, almost pleading, though Elena couldn't understand what it was asking. She strained to listen, leaning in, feeling as though the signal was drawing closer, pressing into her thoughts. Her teammates grew concerned, urging her to take a break, to step back, but Elena refused, haunted by a feeling she couldn't ignore, a compulsion, as if the voice was calling her by name, pulling her in like a gravitational force. One night, as she sat alone in the dimly lit control room, the signal shifted again, becoming louder, clearer, resonating in her mind. The calm voice, once so distant, now felt immediate, personal, as if it were whispering directly into her ear. She listened, holding her breath, feeling a profound sense of déjà vu. The voice echoed her own memories, things no one else should know, things she hadn't thought of in years. She felt her pulse quicken as the voice whispered a phrase from her childhood, one her mother used to say, something so specific, so intimate, it sent a chill down her spine. She looked around, feeling watched, but the room was empty. The observatory was quiet, its walls stretching into the darkness, filled with machines and wires, each silently listening, recording. She was surrounded by technology, and yet she felt more isolated than ever. Her team's unease grew as Elena continued to spiral deeper into her obsession, but she didn't care. She was certain this was no coincidence. The signal was meant for her, directed at her. She spent every waking hour listening, decoding, driven by an inexplicable need to understand. Days passed, and Elena became consumed by the signal, poring over every waveform, every frequency shift, listening to the voice on a loop. The phrases began to take shape, a disjointed whisper that seemed to echo her name, threading personal details into its cryptic monologue. She heard strange words and disjointed sentences, but always it returned to the same haunting phrases, familiar ones she couldn't place but felt etched into her mind, as though she'd known them her entire life. Then one night, as she adjusted the audio, the signal shifted. A lullaby drifted through, the melody clear, soft, piercing her heart with a memory she hadn't recalled in years. It was a lullaby her mother used to sing to her, something private, something no one else could know. She froze, every nerve taut with fear. Her mother's voice, just as she remembered it, had somehow woven itself into the signal from an alien world. It was impossible, yet it was there, carrying a warmth she hadn't felt since childhood, laced with an eerie undercurrent that left her breathless with dread. She tried to share the discovery with her team, but they reacted with skepticism, glancing at each other with uneasy smiles, muttering about fatigue and isolation playing tricks on her. They gently suggested she take a break, saying perhaps she was reading too much into a scrambled transmission. She knew they didn't believe her, saw it in their wary expressions, as if they were humoring her. She resented their dismissal, her isolation deepening as she felt the weight of their doubt. Their condescension only pushed her further, intensifying her obsession. As days went on, strange phenomena began to plague the observatory. Equipment would flicker or shut down without reason. The lights dimmed unexpectedly, casting shadows that seemed to linger a second too long. Static noises whispered through the speakers when no one was transmitting, a hiss of incomprehensible voices, faint but present, as if the observatory itself was beginning to pulse with the rhythm of the signal. She continued to decode, her eyes bloodshot and weary, tracking the voice as it grew sharper, louder. Soon, the words started to form coherent sentences, but they held an unnatural weight, as if they were being delivered not just from a distant planet, but from something far closer, like a shadow lurking behind her shoulder. The voice repeated her name, its tone calm yet laden with an underlying urgency, echoing through her headset late into the night. She barely noticed her surroundings anymore, her world reduced to the cold confines of the observatory and the signal that now seemed to pulse in her veins. Then one night, the voice issued a warning. It was unmistakable now. A phrase repeated in a voice that sounded hauntingly like her own, urging her to be careful, to stay alert. It warned her of something she couldn't quite understand, a danger within the walls, a threat that seemed to pulse around her, building with every repetition. She sat frozen, feeling her skin crawl as the voice continued, whispering cryptic phrases that sent a chill deep into her bones. Her own voice, from some impossible distance, telling her to leave, to remember something she couldn't recall. Panic tightened in her chest as the realization set in. The voice wasn't just alien. It was her voice, or something resembling it, whispering warnings from across some unseen chasm, as if trying to reach her through layers of reality she couldn't comprehend. As the warnings grew more explicit, she found herself retreating further from her colleagues, each day feeling less trustful, more on edge. The isolation became her only comfort, and yet it wasn't safe. She felt eyes on her, invisible presences lurking just beyond the room's dim lights. She'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, shadows shifting in impossible ways. The sense of being watched intensified until she could barely stand to turn her back to the dark hallways, yet she couldn't bring herself to leave. The signal was her only anchor now, her only means of understanding what was happening to her. Then came the final message, a line delivered in a voice that was unmistakably hers, fractured with static and distortion. Remember. The word echoed through her mind, filling her with a dread she couldn't explain. What was she supposed to remember? She racked her brain, struggling to recall, but the memory lay just out of reach, shrouded in a fog she couldn't pierce. Her heartbeat thundered as the voice repeated, "Remember." It was a command, an urgent plea, spoken in a tone that carried a warning meant only for her. The signal consumed her thoughts, but questions gnawed at her. Why had it come from Proxima Centauri B, and why did it feel so personal? She began researching the planet more obsessively, combing through files and restricted data. Her search led her down strange, disquieting paths, stumbling onto mentions of early space programs, classified missions from decades ago. Buried in the records, she found unsettling reports hinting at attempts to study human consciousness through temporal messaging, an experimental process that aimed to reach across time. The documents detailed a mission to Proxima Centauri B with trained astronauts and scientists, all classified as failures. Not a single survivor. She sat back, chills creeping up her spine. These weren't just failed missions. They were abandoned, swept under layers of bureaucracy and redactions. Every line, every missing name felt like a black mark she was never meant to find, a series of tragic endings wrapped in sterile, clinical language. And each discovery only tightened the knot of dread growing in her chest. Why would the signal be so familiar, so human, if it came from a world where no one had survived? As she continued to decode, flashes of distorted memories flickered in her mind, fragments of something half-remembered, as though glimpsed through a fog. Images surfaced, dusty, reddish landscapes, a darkened sky, strange equipment half-buried in alien soil, and people, faces that hovered in her mind's eye, ghostly and unfamiliar, yet somehow known. The memories made no sense, yet they felt intensely real. She would catch herself drifting into them, feeling the cold, sterile air of the observatory give way to the dry, thin atmosphere of a distant world, leaving her with the feeling that she had been there before. She'd shake it off, but the sensation lingered, gnawing at her. The more she delved, the less sure she felt of anything around her or within her. Had she been to Proxima Centauri B? Was it possible? Was she remembering fragments of a past life? Or were they merely hallucinations brought on by stress and isolation? She scoured her own memories, trying to pull them apart, but the harder she tried, the more they seemed to distort, like a mirage receding every time she reached for it. One night, the observatory's director, Dr. Monroe, appeared in her lab, silent and watching. His gaze was cold, assessing. Without preamble, he hinted at information she hadn't yet uncovered, his words slipping past her defenses with a subtle menace. He spoke in clipped phrases about her progress, her dedication to the mission, but his tone held a darker undertone, as though he were measuring her reactions, testing her limits. As he turned to leave, he offered a cryptic remark. "You've come farther than we expected." Something inside her snapped. She demanded to know what he meant, pressing him, asking what the observatory's true purpose was. Monroe paused, expression inscrutable, and for a brief, agonizing moment, she saw a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. Then he left, saying only, "The answers are right in front of you, Dr. Torres." His words spiraled in her mind, the pieces clicking together with a sickening clarity. She felt the walls of the observatory close in, transforming from a sanctuary of knowledge into a prison. She realized she was not just an astronomer tracking a signal. She was part of something much larger, something that had been watching her every move, testing her limits. The observatory wasn't merely receiving data. It was studying her, watching her unravel piece by piece. Her mind whirled with a terrifying possibility. Was she even real? Or had she been constructed? An experiment designed to interpret the signal? A puppet manipulated by unseen forces? She began to suspect she was just one in a series of Elena Torreses, each version created and set on this path, each one breaking down in precisely the same way. Her existence felt hollow, a simulation running in an endless loop. In her desperation, she replayed the signal again and again, looking for answers, until a new message cut through the static, one that froze her blood. "You were never supposed to return." The words hammered in her mind, a brutal reminder that she wasn't meant to find the truth, wasn't meant to question. It was as though some unseen hand had pulled back the curtain, showing her the emptiness behind the facade. Her reality shattered, fragmenting into questions that clawed at her sanity. Who was she? Truly? An experiment? A clone? A figment of some horrific design? She sank to the floor, reeling from the crushing realization that everything she thought she knew had been a lie. A sudden shift in the signal jolted Elena back to her senses. The static gave way to a voice that was unmistakably her own, whispering in desperation, "I am you. Get out. Leave." The words cut through her fear, filled with raw, urgent pleading. She grabbed the communicator, her heart pounding, and called out to her team, her voice tight with panic. But there was only silence. She repeated her call, her voice rising, but the speakers emitted nothing but a soft, empty hum. She was completely alone. Frantic for answers, she left the control room and began searching the observatory, its halls cold and silent, every door a reminder of how vast and empty the facility truly was. In one storage room, she stumbled upon stacks of old, outdated equipment covered in dust. As she sifted through them, she noticed something peculiar. Old data drives with labels that read Dr. Elena Torres, Cycle 27, Cycle 28, and dozens more. Her breath hitched as she realized these labels weren't from her tenure, yet they bore her name, one cycle after another. The truth sank in slowly, an insidious chill that crept over her skin. Each drive held data collected from previous versions of herself, others who had been here, who had lived and died in the same place. She was not the first Elena Torres. She was one of many, a succession of clones, each brought here to endure the same psychological unraveling, each left to discover the terrible truth, just as she had. Her hands shook as she flipped through personnel files, reports detailing subject breakdowns, the spirals of paranoia, the descent into madness, all meticulously cataloged and studied. Dr. Monroe's quiet, detached voice echoed from the doorway, sending a jolt of dread through her. He was calm, matter-of-fact, as if explaining a routine experiment rather than a horrific cycle of torment. "You were part of a study," he said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "We needed to understand human resilience. How much a mind can withstand in prolonged isolation under alien conditions. Each Elena was designed for this purpose." Elena's stomach twisted with revulsion. She was not a person to him. She was data, a specimen in an ongoing experiment. Her existence had never been hers. She was trapped, condemned to relive the same nightmare. Each version of her brought back to experience the same despair, the same moment of crushing realization. Every memory, every personal detail that felt like her own had been implanted, designed to draw out the most raw, human reactions for study. You were never meant to return to Earth, he continued, confirming the words she had heard on the signal. Each of you reaches this point. Each of you has this realization. And each of you fails. It's all part of the data. His tone was eerily calm, as if he were discussing the weather, his eyes devoid of empathy. Her heart hammered as the weight of his words settled on her. The experiment would continue. When she broke, another Elena would take her place, another clone subjected to the same spiral of confusion and horror, bound to the same cold cycle. She realized that if she stayed, she would become another statistic in their files, another broken mind cataloged and studied. But there was another option. She glanced toward the doors leading to the exit, the path to the shuttle that could take her off this hellish observatory. Monroe watched her, as if reading her thoughts. "You can leave," he said almost indifferently, "but the odds of survival beyond this facility are negligible." Elena's mind whirred. The choice was agonizing. Remain here, resigned to her fate, trapped in this endless loop, or risk everything for a slim chance of freedom. Her breath caught as she made up her mind. She turned and ran, heart pounding, ignoring Monroe's cold warnings that followed her down the hall. She reached the exit, her hands shaking as she navigated the controls, every fiber of her being focused on escape. The facility's alarms blared, lights flashing in a frenzy as she darted through the corridors. The air felt thick with the weight of those who had come before her, each previous Elena who had stood at the brink of escape only to succumb. Bursting into the shuttle, she strapped herself in, feeling the surge of adrenaline and terror. She fired up the engines, her vision blurring as she forced herself to breathe, to concentrate. With a roar, the shuttle shot forward, the observatory vanishing in the distance as she hurtled into the unknown. She didn't know if she would make it to Earth, if she would survive the journey, or if there was anything waiting for her at the end of this escape. But for the first time, her fate was her own. Elena moved with silent urgency, slipping through the darkened corridors of the observatory. She kept close to the walls, listening for any sound, but the silence was almost worse, an unnatural stillness, as if the place had emptied of life. She expected to hear footsteps, voices, some trace of human presence. But when she glimpsed a few of her colleagues, they barely reacted, their faces blank, almost mechanical, their eyes empty. She shuddered, realizing that whatever they once were, they no longer had a shred of humanity left. They were as much a part of this place as the walls themselves. At the end of a narrow hall, she found it. The escape pod, old and dust-covered, clearly neglected for years. She opened the hatch and froze, her heart pounding as she noticed something chilling. Scrawled inside the pod were faint, scratched-out letters spelling her name. She ran her fingers over the grooves, feeling a sense of dread tighten her chest. Had another Elena attempted this same escape before? How many others had been driven to this point, so desperate to escape that they left traces behind in this very pod? Swallowing her fear, she climbed inside, her hands shaking as she activated the controls. As the pod powered up, she sent out one final transmission, hoping to reach Earth, hoping someone might hear her story, her warning. Her voice trembled as she spoke, relaying the truth about the experiments, the endless cycle of clones trapped in an unending nightmare. But as she spoke, the signal crackled, breaking up. The distortion grew worse, and as her words faded, they were replaced by a chilling, familiar echo. "You will return." The message resonated through her headset, her own voice, twisted and warped, as if reaching across some impossible distance. She shut her eyes, fighting the terror rising in her throat. The words looped, repeating, hammering into her mind, and she felt a cold certainty settle over her. This wasn't over. She was just one in a line of Elenas. Each one led to believe they were escaping, each one failing to break free. She prepared to launch, but a transmission cut through the static. She froze, heart racing, as her own voice spoke to her from the other side of the comms. "Elena, don't do it. Don't leave." It was her voice, pleading, raw with desperation. Her hands clenched the controls as her voice, her other self, begged her not to go, warning her of something she couldn't fully understand. It was as if the voice was speaking from a place beyond time, a future where she had already failed. But she couldn't stop. She had to escape, to try. With trembling hands, she initiated the launch, feeling the pod's engines roar to life. She held her breath as the observatory shrank into the distance, her heart pounding with a fragile, desperate hope. She looked out the small viewport, the vastness of space stretching before her endless and dark. But as she drifted farther, something outside caught her eye. A planet looming ahead, its surface barren and red under a dim star. Her pulse quickened as she recognized it immediately. Proxima Centauri b. She was staring at the very planet she'd tried to leave behind, the distant world that had drawn her into this nightmare in the first place. A cold dread settled over her as she realized the truth. No matter how far she went, she would always return to this place. It was an unbreakable cycle, a cosmic loop that held her captive. She was bound to repeat this escape, this horror endlessly, each attempt an illusion of freedom that would bring her back to where she began. As the reality sank in, her final scream was lost in the silence of space, leaving only the chilling certainty that she was trapped, caught in a cycle beyond her understanding, destined to be one of many Elenas reaching for freedom, only to be pulled back forever.